On this episode of What the Ship, China eases Australian coal ban. China also buys more crude oil. The container backlog in the United States is clearing. Evergreen agrees to pay Maryland. And Iran is building its own drone carrier. Hi, I'm your host, Al Mercogliano. Welcome back. Happy New Year. It's 2023. We're into our second year of doing this show. And I have to say, when we did this episode a year ago, bringing in 2022, it was a little dour. There was a lot of issues that were lingering over from 2021 into 2022. Hopefully, we have a much more positive experience in 2023 going forward. However, I do think that shipping news around the world will be paramount. And that's why this show, our weekly episode on what's going on with shipping, is really important to give you the lay of the land, or the sea, I should say, of what is going on with shipping both on the ocean environment, inland, and coastal side. So before we go any further, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's go ahead and jump into story number one. So story number one is a classic story that came out of COVID, and this was the ban that China imposed against Australian coal. This issue stemmed from a disagreement among the two countries over COVID protocols. And because China and Australia are close together, I mean, it's about a 7-day voyage from Western Australia up to China, there were issues regarding COVID restrictions and protocols associated with quarantines. And what we're seeing now is China is easing those. So I want to talk a little bit about this story. This is a GCAPTAIN story from Reuters. So one of the things we're seeing is the lifting of the unofficial ban on Australian coal imports, which had begun back in 2020. The decision came after Chinese and Australian leaders met for the first time in 6 years at the G20 summit just this past November. You have a new prime minister, a new government in Australia. They met with the foreign minister of China. And so one of the things we're seeing here is the resumption of this. Now, China had been getting its coal from alternative sources. One of the things that the Belt and Road Initiative, started in 2013 by Chairman Xi, did was try to get redundancy in not just trade routes, but also resources. A couple of quotes right here. The development may have stemmed from the thawing of relations between China and Australia and giving the new government in Canberra. That's per Pat Markey, the managing director of Sierra Vista Resources. Many miners would welcome the opportunity to renew their commercial relationships in China for both metallurgical coal and thermal coal. And we go down here, one of the things we see is why this is happening. So rising prices amid the Russian sanctions and an expected jump in Russian coal demand, as much as 2% more in 2023 than last year, could be the result of this. China purchased more than 30 million tons of coking coal and nearly 50 million tons of thermal coal from Australia before buying stopped. Now, what they did is they shifted over. So without those Australian supplies, China was buying thermal coal from Indonesia and then coking coal from Mongolia and Russia. But that coal was not as of high quality as compared to Australian coal. And so what we're seeing here is the resumption of coal coming from Australia to China. This has a lot of potential indications here. Obviously, for Australia, this is huge news. Australia has been reeling from the downturn in the amount of coal it's been getting. But it also is an indication of thawing of relations, but also the potential for for China to be reopening. If you come back over here a second and we look at this chart from the review of maritime transport for 2022, this table 1.8 really gives you an idea of where bulk material go. And if you look in both iron ore and coal, Australia is a major exporter. In 2021, Australia exported 58% of the world's ore and 35% of the world's coal by sea. Now, this is just by sea we're seeing this, but China was the largest recipient of that. China received 73% of the world's iron ore shipments and 23% of the coal shipments. So obviously a return to a relationship between China and Australia, where Australia is exporting ore, China is receiving ore, is a big benefit for Australia. And it really starts indicating the thawing of relations between those two countries. It's also an indicator that China may not be on the downward trend we tend to see all the time. One of the indicators I always recommend is look at what China is importing, especially in raw material. If China goes down in raw material, then they're going to be producing less, obviously. They're not doing this, but China had a big problem with brownouts and power shortages. This could be an indication that China is resuming some of its levels. This will be down the road, months from now, where we start seeing if Chinese exports start kicking back up. It's not an immediate impact, obviously. The imports into China, especially of raw materials, will take about a 6-month lag before we see it. But that would coincide with peak season that we expect to see in mid-2023, and it could be an indication that China is expecting to resume productions at a certain level. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 2. Story number 2 keeps us with China. This story from Bloomberg over at GCaptain. Increased Chinese crude buying spooks European oil traders. So one of the things we can expect to see here is an increase in oil consumption by China. Obviously, Russia has caused a lot of disruptions in global energy trading. We've been talking about that a lot on this channel over the past year since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But what we're seeing right now is China is beginning its increase. This story, China is snapping up cargoes of crude that would normally head to Europe, spooking the continent's physical oil traders who have just seen imports from Russia all but halt at a time when local demand is rising. We've been seeing decreasing price of oil because of the Russian oil price cap, $60 per barrel. That's the minimum price. That's the maximum price you can have to be able to ship Russian crude out into the world. But you also have the G7 and EU sanctions where you can't import Russian crude anymore. This is a big issue. And what we've seen, and with OPEC cutting back production, we've been shocked to see this oil prices drop. But now what we're seeing is China is back in the market. And if you look at this, one of the things you're seeing here is the shipments to China of crude oil all of a sudden spiked up. And we're seeing them begin to spike up to really peak levels here over the past year. Go into a couple other stories here. This is from Svetlana Parskova. I am doing my best to improve my pronunciations this year. Where are oil prices heading in 2023? This is from oilprice.com. She makes 3 points here. 1, recession is the key word for oil prices. We all know the looming recession has a big problem here. The Fed's isn't abandoning its hawkish stance at the start of the new year and could possibly inflict more damage on the oil markets. And 3, oil bulls see the reopening of the Chinese economy as one of the bullish factors this year. Obviously, if China is starting to consume more crude oil, that is going to cause prices to begin to spike back up. And this could be a potential problem, too, with Russian oil if we start hitting that price cap limit. Go on over to here, another oil price story. European imports of U.S. diesel gasoline to hit a 2-year high. Just want to read this one section. In December, Europe's U.S. loadings for diesel and gasoline reached 660,000 tons. It was the highest amount headed to Europe in any month since September 2020, and a strikingly high 70% increase over cargoes loaded in November. The rush for Europe to stock up on diesel and gas oil comes just a few months ahead of the European Union's full ban on crude oil products set to begin on February 5th. So we just had the December 5th ban on Russian oil by sea, but full ban goes into effect on February 5. And what we see is Europe is scrambling to buy diesel and oil. And obviously with China buying more oil, with diesel shortages in the U.S., largely because of this, because oil traders or gasoline energy traders are shipping that diesel over to Europe, this is what's causing the diesel shortage. And you can see that in the EIA's report, This Week in Petroleum. Again, my favorite report of all time right here. You can see it in this report right here. Unlike crude oil and gasoline prices, which finished 2020 below their January averages, the distillate price ended this year higher than both January 2022 and its 5-year average. Through October 2022, strong distillate demand and disruptions in international trade continued to drawdowns its distillate inventories globally and added upward pressure in prices that were already near 8-year highs before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And this is the 5-year, that gray is that kind of 5-year average of distillate inventories, and you can see how 2022 is just below that, and it ticked back up almost to the bottom of the 5-year average. But now with this increased amount of distillate going over to Europe, we're going to see that drop. You're going to hear a lot of screams from energy traders right now to want to waive the Jones Act to get diesel up into the Mid-Atlantic and New England area. But my caveat for that all the time is, okay, where's that diesel going? Is it going into the energy market in that area, or is it because the energy traders are hauling diesel out of the pipeline, the Colonial Pipeline, and shipping it over to Europe? And they're just stealing from one to pay for the other, which I think is what is going to happen. And again, you got to be really careful about this, because again, what we don't see is the transparency of how this energy moves. And I think that is a big issue. We just had a shutdown in one line of the Colonial Pipeline because of an oil spill. Opened back up again very quickly. We'd seen the shutdown in the XL pipeline coming across from Canada down to the refineries in the Midwest. We're putting a lot of pressure on our energy transportation system, and it's showing, unfortunately. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 3. Story number 3, the coast is almost clear as port congestion fades even further. So Greg Miller over at FreightWaves is talking about the fact that the delays that had once plagued LA and Long Beach had moved to the eastern Gulf Coast. We saw huge lines off Houston, New York, New Jersey, and in particularly Savannah. They are almost gone now. There were predictions of clearing these queues way back when Savannah was talking about clearing them back in November. But again, they had not quite done that yet. So here's the latest picture that Greg has. This is of the end of the year where we're seeing this. But again, here's the port of Savannah, ships waiting to get in off the port of Savannah. There were, up to 25 ships waiting to get into East and Gulf Coast ports. Here it is off of Norfolk coming in. This is off of Houston, and basically all the other ports are back to their pre-COVID levels. And again, one of the things they use is these port delay charts to kind of show where everything is at. I think there's a couple of issues I have with this story right here. I think Greg is exactly right. We're seeing the clearing of these ports, which I think is a major issue. However, the caveat I go to this story is that these ports are at much higher levels than they were pre-COVID. I think even if we clear the backlogs off New York, New Jersey, Savannah, and Houston, the levels these ports are operating at are substantially increased, because what we've seen is a shift from the West Coast to the East and Gulf Coast. Over 50% of containers now are coming to the East and Gulf Coast. And that has a lot to do with a variety of issues that are going on the West Coast, not the least of which was the massive backlog in those terminals that made it extremely difficult for shippers to get their boxes clear of the terminals. Unless you were going into the LBC terminal in Long Beach, Traypac in LA, you had delays like crazy to get your containers off. Add to it, we still do not have an agreement between the ILWU and the PMA for a labor contract for the West Coast ports. You have rail issues, you have trucking issues, the AB5 provisions in there, but more importantly, as of January 1st, 2023, if you have a truck with an engine that's older than 2010, you can't operate in California. And that takes a good piece of the drayage and long-haul trucks off the board for going into Los Angeles. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Let me be clear. I understand emissions, but the problem is for shippers who want to get their cargo, they have realized that it's easier to go into the East and Gulf Coast ports. Plus, these ports have developed the infrastructure necessary. They've developed the warehouses, the distribution centers, the short-haul rail system, the short-haul truck system. Plus, the bulk of the U.S. population is east of Texas. And that's what you see happening here. Because at the same time you get this story from Greg, you get this story over at FreightWaves. The Port of Houston is moving forward with container dwell fees after delay, a $45 per day charge designed to reduce containers sitting idle at 2 terminals. So obviously the Port of Houston is dealing with congestion. In other words, there's more traffic coming into the Port of Houston. And so they need to get this going. Now, you've heard me rail about container and hyper demurrage done by the Port of LA and Long Beach, which for over a year threatened to impose this ridiculous hyper demurrage. This is a $100 fee for containers sitting over 9 days on the terminal, increasing by $100 fee every day. And it was just insane. And they never imposed it either. Let me be clear. Houston and New York, New Jersey are serious with this fee, and they intend to impose on it because they want to keep the yards clear. If the yards get backlogged, it becomes inefficient to move containers off, and they realize that if their container yards become clogged and trucks and rail come in and they can't get the containers, then people will shift back to the West Coast where rates are suppressed. I mean, they're down. They are way down. And so what the East Coast, Gulf Coast terminals are worried about is losing that business. At the same time, this story is a really interesting one from Lodestar. Louisiana, the next hot U.S. gateway with plans for a major box terminal. Talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Louisiana, especially New Orleans, is talking about a huge new terminal coming in. They're talking about a terminal coming in. They've got Ports America and MSC, Mediterranean Shipping, have pledged $800 million to $1.8 billion for a container facility at the Port of New Orleans that could bring capacity of 2 million TEU to the port. Construction is supposed to kick off in 2025 with the first berth due open in 2028. So I'm going to hop on an issue here that needs to be talked about, and this is going to be short sea shipping and inland waterway shipping. If you put a container terminal into New Orleans, which makes the most sense in the world, you have got to develop a system whereby you can move containers by barge up the rivers and along the coast. That would be fantastic, but it's going to take coordination, and the entity that should be doing this is the Maritime Administration through their inland waterways, the American Maritime Highway System. That's what we should be talking about. This is a fantastic opportunity to really see development. If you see U.S. shipbuilding in the United States, where it does extremely well, yeah, we don't build the big, huge ocean-going vessels like China, Japan, and Korea do, but we do very well at coastal and inland waterways. This is an area that has the potential to be developed, I think, in the long term, and I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes. All right, let's jump over to story number 4. Story number 4 comes to us from maritime executive Evergreen, required to pay Maryland $700,000 due to EverForward grounding. Okay, it's a new year, but we're still talking about stories that started this channel. The whole channel started in March of 2021 with the grounding of Evergiven in the Suez. Past spring, we talked a lot about EverForward, and EverForward is a story that just does not seem to want to go away. So this story in Maritime Executive really hits a key thing. Maryland is requiring Evergreen, operators of the container ship EverForward that grounded in the Chesapeake Bay in March of 2022, to pay fines for the restoration of the aquatic habitat. The Maryland Department of Natural Resources studied the impact of the grounding and subsequent refloating. Now remember, this refloating was a huge process, required the removal of over 500 containers and the dredging of an area of about 14 acres in the area, including within the boundary of a natural oyster bed. And so the impact here is in the fishing and oysters in the area. Plus, there was an issue with the dredging laying dust from the, not really dust, but dirt on crabs and impacting that. At a meeting on January 4th, the Maryland Board of Public Works made modifications to the emergency wetlands license that requires Evergreen to pay $676,200. The amount was determined by the Natural Resources Sailfish Division, which estimated the cost at $588,000 and was increased by 15% to cover potential increases in markets. Maryland plans to reseed oysters in 41 acres of the Chesapeake Bay. So we talked about this not too long ago in the fact that the Coast Guard recently released a report basically putting the blame for the grounding on two people in particularly. I'll have the link to the video here. I think one of my funniest videos with fine acting by me, on both the pilot from the Maryland Pilots Association and the ship's master for not being up on the bridge during a key turn before they got into clear area south of the Bay Bridge. And again, this could have been so much worse. Understand, the grounding of Ever Forward could have shut down the port of Baltimore. It could have resulted in an oil spill or a fuel spill from the vessel. It could have resulted in so much worse. And I think really this issue is an important one. Evergreen has to be punished for basically allowing this to happen. However, I do think that Evergreen now will file suit against the Maryland Pilot Association and push this blame onto the pilot and try to get this money recouped by the Pilot Association. It'll be interesting to see what happens here. There was a case in the United States involving a ship called the Costco Busan that was sailing out of San Francisco, where that ship struck a bridge, the bridge piling coming out of San Francisco and Oakland, and the pilot was held responsible, actually jailed, for a spill into the Bay area there. So pilots are not basically exempt from prosecution, at least not under the United States. Although masters are ultimately responsible for the safe navigation of their vessels, pilots have been held accountable. And we're seeing that in this case right now, especially when it becomes obviously clear based on the investigation by the Coast Guard that the pilot was not paying attention. It was pure human error. He lost situational awareness and missed the turn to head southbound out of Baltimore into Chesapeake Bay. All right, let's go ahead and head over to our last story. So one of the books I recommend all the time is a book by Bruce Jones and it's entitled To Rule the Waves. And what Bruce Jones does is he talks about the fact that post-World War II, and also I will also mention Mark Levinson's most recent book talks about this too, is that post-World War II, the United States and its allies created an open ocean whereby global trade could prosper. And really, if you look post-World War II to the modern day, there's been very few obstructions to global trade on the ocean. Yes, we've had conflicts. There have been issues. The most probably obvious one was the tanker war of the 1980s in the Persian Gulf. We may see something similar developing in the Black Sea right now. But largely, ocean shipping had been able to go, yeah, there were pirates, the Somali pirates, but in truth, that was a gnat on a buffalo. It was not a big issue. However, this story from Maritime Executive, which comes from H.I. Sutton over at Covert Shores, is one I think should start giving us a little bit of pause. Iran is converting two Panamax Boxships into drone carriers. Come down here, the Iran Islamic Revolutionary Guard Boxship to Warship conversion project appears to be aimed at producing drone carriers. Last year, open source intelligence analysts obtained a photo of what appeared to be the new IRGC Bay ship at a shipyard in Bandar Abbas. The vessel's deckhouse and hull were painted a coat of haze gray with gun emplacements on the stern, but her lines were identical to a Panamax box ship. However, the details may differ slightly. The new photos, analyzed by H.I. Sutton, appear to indicate the ship is being fitted with a giant overhanging deck on her port side, like an exaggerated version of an aircraft carrier's flight deck. Goes on here, while this may not be quite an aircraft carrier, neither does it appear to be a base ship. Iran local media accounts suggest that the vessel will become something unique, a storage and launch platform for Iran's militarized drones. It also appears that the IRGC will be converting two box ships to a drone carrier configuration. I'm going to come over here to the story on Covert Shores. This is it right here. And I'm going to scroll down here because I want to show you the images. This is the images that you're seeing here. So this is looking off the port bow forward. You see the old container ship cells right here, but this is the overhang that's being mounted on the port side with a potential kind of flight pattern here. Understand, Iranian drones have been attacking basically Israeli-owned vessels for a couple of years now. We've seen these. They've been launched largely out of Bandar Abbas and the south shore of Iran toward vessels that are operating either in the Persian Gulf or out in the Gulf of Oman. But we've also seen this happen in the Red Sea to a lesser extent. But now Iran is outfitting two vessels that could become basically these drone-style carriers. And these vessels will make the potential for the open seas to be basically the Wild West in some ways for the Iranians to attack shipping on the high seas. They could be targeting Israeli-owned shipping. They could target any shipping. But remember, most shipping is not under national flags anymore. They're under open registries: Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands, Cyprus, Isle of Man. And so the Iranians could basically wage war against certain ships and certain owners, really with very little checks against them. We have seen that the drone attacks that have been done by the Iranians really have not been countered as much. We've seen drone attacks, we've seen limpet mine attacks. We've seen this for quite a few years now coming out of Iran, but this potential to go mobile and attack shipping out on the high seas, this could be an escalation that we're seeing. What if Ukraine does this and outfits a vessel to attack Russian vessels on the high seas in international waters? What happens if other nations begin to do this? Again, we've had peaceful seas for nearly 70-some years post-World War II. There have been exceptions, there have been wars. I'm not saying it hasn't been completely without it, but largely the open oceans have allowed this massive growth in trade. But now the Iranians have the potential here to destabilize the area. And this could be other nations. We're already seeing other nations doing this. Turkey has taken some amphibious vessels, outfitting them as drone carriers. Aircraft carriers are expensive. Not everybody can afford F-35B Lightnings jump jets. We see Japan and Korea doing that. But other nations can outfit these drone carriers. And drones can operate with almost no identification on them. And how do you trace them back? Very difficult to do. Are we going back to the golden age of mercantilism where piracy ran amok? I don't know. But this is a new challenge that we see on the horizon going forward. Navies need to be thinking about this. What's the U.S. Navy plan to counter, these issues out there? What flag am I going to fly on my commercial ship? Because if I'm flying the flag of Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands, I'm basically hoping that the seas are peaceful. But what if they start getting attacked by drones or forced to pay money to sail through, the old age of tribute, the Barbary pirates? This could change the way shipping is handled on the open ocean. It's an interesting inflection point going forward, something we should be thinking about in 2023. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. Listen, this page has grown tremendously. We opened in March of 2021 and got 30,000 subscribers in the first year. 2022, 40,000 additional subscribers. We're at the cusp of 70,000 subscribers right now. So obviously my goal is to get this channel up and over 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year. But in truth, the issue of subscribers is great, but I just want to keep the channel going. That is my big goal. Whether I have 70,000 or 700,000, it doesn't matter. What I like to do is keep the channel going. And I do that through the support of people like you who watch, subscribe, like, share, and more importantly, those who contribute to the page, either through that super thanks button below or over on Patreon. And over on Patreon, you become a patron of the page. You become a weekly a monthly or yearly subscriber for just a few dollars. And it goes to allow me to keep this channel going and devote resources that I would typically be doing other jobs for. But I enjoy this much more. Until our next video, this is Sal, signing off.